Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be moving on to another one of Descartes' meditations. We'll call this one Meditation 4. And Meditation 4 has the title, Concerning the True and the False. And in this meditation, what's going to happen is, although we're going to look at a philosophical problem, this meditation is actually going to deal with one of the problems that Descartes looked at the very beginning of the meditations. You'll recall that the problem early on was, how do I know, right, which of my beliefs are true and which of my beliefs are false? And in this meditation, we're going to explore that. Now, to get this going, though, Descartes is going to give us a new problem. And the problem is this. You'll recall from Meditation 3 that if Descartes is correct, God exists, and, of course, we know this because God is this perfect being. Now, there's a funny problem here because if God is perfect, God is therefore the type of being who would not deceive him because he's all good, right? And so deception's impossible. And yet, Descartes, who is, all of us who presumably are created by God, we have a faculty for judgment that we received from God. After all, God made us. Now the question arises, if God is all perfect, and we came from God, God made us, and God doesn't make junk because God is perfect, then how is it possible that we make mistakes, especially when we're trying to figure out what's true and what's false? And so that'll be really the question that we're going to take up in this video today. Now, the big question is going to be, when I make mistakes, what is the source of error? And Descartes is going to say that for him, there are two possible sources. One possibility is something that he will call the intellect, and the other possibility is something that he will call his will. Now, before moving on, I want to say a little bit more about these two things and explain in Descartes' terms what they do. So, you might say that the intellect's main function is to grasp the truth. Another characteristic of the intellect is that the intellect is also limited. So, for example, while I may think various things are true, the information that I have access to is actually quite limited. Now, the will, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Its job is to, in the case of truths, affirm, deny, or suspend judgment about things. I sometimes like to tell students in class, its job is to say thumbs up about things, that's affirming. It can say thumbs down, that's denying. Or it can shrug its shoulders, not sure. Right, so that's suspending judgment. Another job that Descartes describes for the will later is that the will also pursues things or avoids things. You might say that it either wants things or does not want them. But when it comes to truth, we will say that it affirms, denies, or suspends judgment. Now, the question becomes, what's the main problem? Okay, and as we're going to see, the question is, well, is it the intellect's fault? Is it the fault of the will? Or something else? Now, this is what Descartes says. From these considerations, I perceive that the power of willing, which I got from God, is not, taken by itself, the cause of my errors, for it is most ample as well as perfect in its kind. Nor is my power of understanding the cause of my errors, for since I got my power of understanding from God, whatever I understand rightly, I doubtless understand. So whatever I understand, I doubtless understand rightly, and it is impossible for me to be deceived in this. Now, this would seem to be saying that what Descartes is suggesting is that the power of the will by itself is not the problem. The will has this ability and it can say yes, no, or shrug its shoulders to just about anything. Meanwhile, the understanding itself is not the problem either. Right? He says he got his power of understanding from God, so whatever he understands rightly. So neither one of these things by itself is the problem. So that's peculiar. What is the problem then? Well, Descartes continues the passage. He says, what then is the source of my errors? They are owing simply to the fact that, since the will extends further than the intellect, I do not contain the will within the same boundaries. Rather, I also extend it to things I do not understand. Because the will is indifferent with regard to such matters, it easily turns away from the true and the good, and in this way I am deceived and I sin. So the idea here is that if we go back to this description of the will and the intellect, the will, if you like, is much more powerful than the intellect. It can do a lot more things. The intellect, meanwhile, is much more limited. And so because the will extends further than the intellect, this is the problem. Now this raises the question then, how do we then solve the problem and avoid falling into error? And Descartes is going to suggest a rather simple rule. So we ask the question, how should Descartes use his will and understanding together in the correct way? The answer, he says, is, I should affirm something as true only when I clearly and distinctly perceive it to be true. We'll call this the CDP rule. Now, before moving on, I think the question I would ask here is, do you think this is a good rule? And if you were going to build your own rule, what would it look like? I think really this is one of the key takeaways of Meditation 4. Descartes here is giving you a rule for when you should believe something. Of course, you're free to reject that rule and build your own, but I think it's worth thinking about every now and then. Why do I believe what I believe? And if I was going to give myself a rule to tell me when I should believe something, how do I do that? Now, one more illustration here, I think, of the CDP rule. One way I sometimes like to think about this in class. We're talking about the problem here, and the problem, as we saw, here I've got my will, and let it be represented here with this orange box. And the intellect, meanwhile, is this much smaller blue area. Now, how do we solve the problem, right? If we're using the rule of clarity and distinctness, the CDP rule, how do we do this? Well, very simple. Here, I'll give you some short animations. There we go. The answer is we should restrain the will within the boundaries of the intellect. Or if you like, if we think about what the will's job is, the will can affirm, it can deny, or it can suspend judgment. Its job then, when done correctly, is to suspend your judgment or affirm things, say yes to them, only when the intellect provides it with enough information to do so. Descartes thinks if we do that, right, we've solved the problem. And of course, Descartes, that's a very high standard for this, right? The intellect is supposed to, right, only affirm, right, it should, right, when clearly and distinctly perceiving something, only then should the will affirm something. Right, now we move on to one final problem, though, that does seem to arise because of this rule. Okay, recall again that Descartes in Meditation 3 says that his idea of God, right, when he clearly and distinctly perceives it, now there's that language again, right, he's perceiving this thing that is all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful, completely perfect, and independent. And that seems to work just fine. However, see if you can spot this problem as we work through it. Let's think about our proof of God's existence from Meditation 3 again. Well, remember here, Descartes asserts, right, God exists. And you might ask the question, how does Descartes know that God exists? The answer is that, well, because Descartes clearly and distinctly perceives that God exists. Remember, he has this idea in his mind. He clearly and distinctly perceives it. And whatever he clearly and distinctly perceives is true. But then the question becomes, how does Descartes know that whatever he clearly and distinctly perceives is true? Well, the answer to that, perhaps surprisingly, is he knows that whatever he clearly and distinctly perceives is true because, well, God is no deceiver, and God, in some sense, guarantees that those perceptions are true. But wait, if that's true, then God has to exist in order to guarantee them. And it looks like then we're back where we started, right? We're, again, claiming that God exists, and this has to be the case in order to prove that God exists. This is sometimes called the Cartesian circle, right? This problem, that in some sense Descartes has gotten himself into a circle as a result of arguing for this. One thing you might consider is, right, can Descartes get himself out of this problem? Okay, that does it for meditation 4. I'll see you in the discussion boards. Thank you for listening.